Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Syria.
The message you see in the media is one thing, and reality is something else.
We're 10 months into a story that we still do not know enough about. Another Latin American press corps taking its life into its hands. This time, it's Guatemala. Young love 1, moral policing 0. A Pakistani vigilante gets the boot from the airwaves. And the beauty of books captured in images. Our viral video of the week. Ever since last March, when video first surfaced of demonstrations in the city of Daraa, Syria has seldom been out of the news. And this past week, it's been in the headlines. The violence continues. The casualty list grows. There was the suspension of the Arab League's monitoring mission there and the showdown at the UN on what to do next. With all of the diplomatic activity, it is still hard to know what to believe about what's happening inside Syria. President Assad's deal with the Arab League allowed a few foreign news crews into the country, but did they get anywhere near the real story? Citizen journalism continues to be a vital component in the coverage, but that video is often accompanied by disclaimers from news organizations that cannot vouch for the authenticity of the material. Our starting point this week is Syria, a country that's back under a media blackout.
Syria keeps reporters away from its brutal crackdown.
Foreign media expelled from the country.
Foreign correspondents are largely restricted in their reporting.
The Syrian government hasn't tolerated any sort of media coverage at all.
Control over the domestic media is very, very tight.
Let's go. We just got word that security is coming.
All the journalists, all the reporters in Syria are dealt with as enemy.
It's really hard to cover that story. It's probably the most challenging story to cover.
When, at the insistence of the Arab League, Syria agreed to open its borders to a few foreign news organizations, Al Jazeera was not among them.
Syrian authorities won't let us into that country, so Anita McNaught is monitoring events from Istanbul.
Those that were included Britain's BBC, US networks CNN, NBC, and National Public Radio, American newspapers The New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, and the British paper The Guardian.
They're very controlling. When you do get to Syria with a journalist visa, as I discovered only a couple of weeks ago, then you are quite limited in what you can do, and the controlling attitude of the authorities is quite clear from the start. It doesn't mean that you can't do anything at all, but it does mean that formally, at least, you're under on a pretty tight rein.
We went in on a government trip.
The BBC did very good reports about Syria. They could compensate a bit because they have high level of professionalism to detect where to go. But on the other hand, they could not meet these real people who were suffering and dying. For example, Sakba in Damascus suburbs. So they will not be able to get the real picture.
Once these journalists arrived at the hotels were actually selected for them. There would be a minder, supposedly just a minder in the government, but really someone with the secret police. If this journalist so much as moved, they would follow this journalist. So freedom wasn't something that these journalists have. We wouldn't dare call their phones. We know that their phones are being monitored because they were provided to them by the government. So it was always very hard.
During that same period, Syrian state-owned television covered President Assad's address to the nation. The channel showed what appeared to be a square packed with citizens. A blogger provided a different view of the square and a quite different story. Another incident on state-run TV involved a phone-in show and a caller accusing the channel of lying and misleading Syrians. The anchor told viewers the channel was experiencing audio problems.
This is a state-owned television, and so they will have to toe the government line. In their view, what Syria is going through is a conspiracy from foreign elements, from foreign countries like the US, like Israel, like Saudi Arabia. And these Arab satellite channels are just part of the game.
Particularly the Arabic language satellite broadcasters. Al Jazeera, I have to say, takes pride of place there.
نحن منجرحين من الجزيرة، متضايقين من الجزيرة كثير، هي شريكة بالمؤامرة على سوريا.
Syria blames other countries for conspiring, it blames the media, but of course appears unwilling to address the issue of clearly serious grievances of the Syrian people itself. So the media war is very much part of this war over Syria.
If you watch state media in Syria, you watch state TV, you'll see programs day by day on talking about Al Jazeera and how Al Jazeera is basically part of a conspiracy formed by the West. And some people actually tend to believe this stuff, and that's why the regime keeps doing it.
في هذه المجسمات ستتابع الجزيرة عملية الفبركة الإعلامية والخدع السينمائية.
And so the way they attack these channels is the way they attack foreign forces and their enemies. They consider them as part of the battle and players, not just TV channels who are reporting what's happening there.
In addition to attacking the messengers working in the mainstream media, the Assad government has gone after citizen journalists and the raw news material they provide. News organizations struggle to determine if the video that comes out via social networks is what activists claim it is. That's where groups like the Syrian Network for Human Rights come in. Consisting of Syrians living abroad with connections inside the country, they help mainstream outlets determine what is genuine and what is not.
So there are three levels: the activists on the ground, those activists who are outside the country and can verify or can document or can put extracts of these details, and then the media, which should be not only passive but active and try to verify this. So at the end of the day, we will have something out of the country, give us a picture of what's going on.
Many times we get these videos from activists that have been sending such videos for the past few months and have built up a certain level of credibility, so that makes it easier. In other cases, when the video is a bit more controversial or it's from news sources, we have to make an extra effort. We have to call as many people as possible.
It's very difficult in individual cases to verify a specific video. But the sheer mass of them, the quality of them, the ability to cross-reference, particularly in the presence of the Arab League monitors in those videos, at times when we've known or been able to confirm that they were in a particular place, and that has enabled us to be, fairly certain that they are accurate.
The coverage of this story was a lose-lose situation. The Assad government did not want to let foreign journalists in. That was forced on it by the Arab League. And the journalists did not want their work hampered by minders. They were forced on them by the Syrian authorities. This was a compromise all round. The news outlets got their story, at least part of it, and the Assad government sent the outside world a message of sorts.
The message you see in the media is one thing, and reality is something else.
The government knew that the picture of the protesters on the ground demanding the toppling of the regime is a picture that's out anyway. It's going on YouTube, and the activists have found their own ways on how to transmit these pictures. The picture that was not on TVs was the pictures of the supporters of the government. And the government was very keen to show the international community that it's very much firmly in control, and that when they decide to pressure the government, they should take that in consideration.
Our Global Village voices now on the coverage of the story in Syria.
International media using footage shared by citizens from within Syria is extremely good news. International journalists are not allowed in the country, and local journalists are killed. So if anyone is to blame for some sources not being completely reliable, it's the government who tries to isolate citizens by not allowing them to communicate with the world.
Introducing the National Information Council in Syria only institutionalizes repression. The country has always suffered from censorship on radio, print, TV, and the internet. The decision-making has always come from the mukhabarat, the Syrian intelligence, and will always continue to be so. I really don't think that creating this entity does anything to improve the status of press freedoms and civil freedoms in general in Syria.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. In the ongoing culture war on the Pakistani airwaves between liberal and conservative voices, this was a rare victory for the liberals. Maya Khan, the host of a popular morning show on Sama TV, has been fired for taking her so-called vigilante act a little too far. Khan and her team decided to do some moral policing on January 17th, descending with their cameras on a park in Karachi, confronting young couples, demanding to know if they were married, and if they weren't, lecturing them on their immoral behavior. That provoked an outcry and suggestions that the media in Pakistan are starting to behave like the Taliban. After Ms. Khan refused to issue a full and proper apology, her bosses fired her, despite the high ratings that her show was getting. Khan is not the only media figure in Pakistan doing this kind of thing. In South Asia, the term auntie often refers to a bossy older woman, hence the new media term, vigilante. The judicial inquiry into the phone hacking scandal continues in the UK, and the story is spreading beyond the news of the world and into the country's best-selling newspaper, The Sun. According to reports in The Guardian, the arrests of 4 executives at The Sun came after investigators were handed what the paper calls the largest cache of evidence ever gathered by a police operation in Britain. That cache has been codenamed Datapool 3 and is said to consist of several 100 million recovered emails from former employees at the now-defunct News of the World that the company reportedly tried to delete from its server, as well as invoices, reporters' expense claims, bank and phone records. This is a disturbing development for Rupert Murdoch and News Corp, not only because the company could be asked by the courts why it tried to destroy the evidence, but also because investigators will be combing through Datapool 3 for any evidence that shows the Murdoch family knew about the hacking of phones while it was going on. If Somalia is the most dangerous country in Africa to work as a journalist, then being the director of the Shabelle Media Network is probably the most dangerous job. Hassan Osman Abi is the 3rd director at Shabelle to be murdered since 2007 and the 2nd Somali journalist killed in the past 2 months. Abdi was shot and killed in an ambush outside his home in Mogadishu. He became the director of Shabelle, a network that's comprised of a radio and TV station as well as a news website, in October of last year. Radio Shabelle is one of the most respected privately owned stations in Somalia. It recently uncovered cases of government corruption. However, it appears as though the Islamic militant group Al-Shabaab was behind this killing. Al-Shabaab has said on its website that Abdi's death would serve as a lesson to other journalists. Hands up anyone who saw this one coming. Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks frontman, has agreed to host an interview program on a Russian news channel that's funded by the Kremlin.
2 years ago, we invited Mr. Assange to speak on air. And in about 2 months, we're going to bring him back.
The show, entitled The World Tomorrow, will feature a series of interviews with, according to Assange, key political players, thinkers, and revolutionaries, and will begin airing in March on Russia Today. RT's editor-in-chief, Margarita Simionyan, said everything we do on the air is different from the English language mainstream. That is something we have in common with Assange. Here at the Listening Post, we did a piece on RT a couple of weeks ago. Analysts told us that this channel is on a constant Cold War footing and is much more comfortable reporting on Occupy Wall Street or the London riots than on anything that's critical of its paymasters in the Kremlin. The Russian owner of the UK's Independent and London Evening Standard newspapers, Alexander Lebedev, has tweeted on this, saying, "Shame on you, Mr. Assange. Hard to imagine a more miserable finale for a world order challenger than employee of state-controlled Russia Today." Latin America has provided the Listening Post with a rich vein of media stories to mine. We've reported on Argentina, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Honduras, and Venezuela. This week, we're looking at Guatemala. The country does have its media issues. The drug war spilling over from Mexico brings with it dangers for Guatemalan journalists. Organized crime mobs have silenced many a reporter in the past, and now vigilante security groups, bands of Guatemalans out to enforce order, are proving problematic to report on. Not only that, but the Guatemalan media are trying to figure out what to make of the country's new president, ex-military man Otto Perez Molina. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on freedom of the press and Guatemala.
When the newspapers land on the stands of the capital, Guatemalans must learn to read between the lines, because the people doing the reporting don't have it easy.
Guatemala is being a very dangerous country for a lot of journalists.
If journalists feel threatened, they don't feel secure, they won't report issues of extreme importance to the citizens.
You say what is happening, but you don't say who. And that is the thin red line in Guatemala reporting.
Journalist Lucia Escobar lives in hiding. She wrote an article for El Periódico on the disappearance of a local man in the town of Banajachel. The incident came after a law was passed giving citizens the right to patrol the streets to make up for the police vacuum. Escobar wrote on how this had led to a culture of vigilantism, where locals were taking the law into their own hands. We spoke to her at a secret location.
I realized this was an important story, but I kind of set myself on fire by writing it. When it was published, the mayor, the commission chief, and the police appeared on TV saying I was a narco and that I would end up on a rubbish heap.
Ahí se merece ir a parar toda esa gente que escribe calumnias, que difama sin tener fundamento.
Yo estaba en Guatemala, digamos.
I couldn't go back. The newspaper said they would back the story, but said it wasn't safe to go back. This is a war, and it's serious, they said.
Journalist Lucia spoke out. So what happened to her is what happens to you if you speak out and you name names in the bigger Guatemala context.
So Lucia Escobar is a journalist living in internal exile. And although the men who made the threats have now been arrested, next time she's going to think twice about what she reports.
Before I used to write and nothing happened. But now that my voice is more known, there are more repercussions. So I have to be more careful.
In the cases of freedom of speech, we really have to be very careful, and we really have to be very, vigilant of what is going on. There's a lot of self-censorship in this country. I have been working in journalism for the last 23 years, and I can tell you that we really censor ourselves.
Journalists in Guatemala have had big stories to cover recently. Just last month, they reported on former dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, who is facing charges of genocide during the country's civil war. Ríos Montt has had a difficult relationship with the press. Back in 2003, during his failed bid for presidency, his supporters took to the streets and turned on the media. That's the voice of one reporter who died of a heart attack when fleeing for his life. Journalists call that day Black Thursday. Guatemala's new president, Otto Pérez Molina, served as a general in Ríos Montt's army. Guatemalans voted for him in November's elections after he promised to rule with an iron fist. But what does this election mean for freedom of the press?
We will not permit the persecution of journalists. This government will guarantee that journalists have access to information, but also that they are able to exercise their right to express themselves in the way they need to. We are going to respect the media because it strengthens democracy and the country's institutions.
That's the kind of message Guatemala's journalists wanted to hear, but it may prove to be easier said than done.
I think the words of President Otto Pérez Molina are really encouraging for the media, especially if he says he's respecting press freedom. However, we have to look at history, and what we have seen in Guatemala over the last few years is not really respect for press freedoms. Journalists have been, for many years, suffering for intimidation and threats.
I have known him for a lot of time, and we just printed 3 weeks before he was elected president, I guess the most wide and deep story of his public life that you could ever find in Guatemala. We were telling about all the cases that he could be suspect of during the war, which included atrocities and massive killings in the area where he was working at. And he didn't say not even a negative word on that piece.
But is this retired general really a changed man? And is he the statesman he claims to be? his pledge to use military commando units has journalists dealing with memories of the past and fears for the future.
Unfortunately, every time governments try to use force, journalists suffer, press freedom suffer, and transparency suffer because journalists won't be able to really report.
People want security, but voting for a military is not getting security, it's getting control and reducing liberty for people. And definitely one of the first liberties you need to reduce or control is liberty of expression.
And whether the new president means what he says or not, in a country where the army and the national police are often complicit in the drugs wars themselves, and where the lines of allegiance are constantly in flux, telling the story has become a very slippery business.
The country is very unstable. There is no defined power structures. It's not like the past where you had military versus subversion and you knew the good guys and the bad guys. Now we don't know who the good guys are and the bad guys are. So it's difficult to know where you are in relationship to the power structures in Guatemala because not all of them are visible. Most of them are invisible.
More Global Village Voices now on the media story in Guatemala.
Perez Molina is a conservative politician, and in Guatemala we have a traditional, very conservative media, so probably for the 4 years of his administration, they will be more benevolent, they will be more passive, more tolerant with Perez Molina's acts. So I don't believe he's going to have a strong confrontation with the traditional media.
The new president of Guatemala, Otto Perez Molina, met with the Guatemalan Journalists Association and signed a document agreeing to adhere to standards of freedom of expression, which is a positive step forward. There are some journalists, however, who are concerned that having this former military man leading the country could mean a return to repression and authoritarianism. This is especially their concern in light of the fact that journalists who reported on human rights abuses during the war currently are facing lawsuits brought by former military officers and their supporters.
Finally, some of our favorite web videos of the week have been very simple, low-tech productions that have just happened to capture the imagination of people and then gone viral. The following video is the opposite of that. 29 people were involved in the production. An original score was composed specifically for this little film, and it is obvious how much work went into the stop-motion video. This is called The Joy of Books. It was filmed at a bookshop in Toronto, and it's worth every one of the more than 2.5 million hits it's got so far. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.